Awesome. Hi, everybody. Thanks for watching, I guess, again. We've had a pretty great response to the last couple videos that we put out. So thank you, everyone, for interacting, engaging with us. Just to intro myself and Eric again. My name is David Choe. I'm the co-founder of Staat. Staat is a automated inbox for development leaders, basically anybody who helps to manage technical humans. We bring together data from Git repositories and project management tools into one simple unified view. And really, we're on a mission to rethink engineering management and really help engineering managers and leaders to understand their teams better, understand themselves better. So yeah, that's what status, what I'm up to. Eric, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Eric Gong. I am a VP of engineering term recruiter. I never get sick of that, saying that these days. My background is I'm a startup engineer, worked across 4 different startups. My last company, I started as a director of engineering and became a VP of engineering. Had about 50 engineers total on the team. And when I decided to leave that company, I decided to build a recruiting company because number one, that was something that I realized I was very good at. And that was also a major problem in the industry. So here I am, a former VP of engineering running a recruiting company and loving it
Awesome.
every day.
That's great. All right. Well, so this week we have a pretty, I'd say, juicy topic. This is something that, I have many conversations on a weekly basis with various engineering leaders, and it's the topic of performance and performance metrics for teams. So, Eric, I would love for you to talk a little bit about your history and experience with thinking about performance metrics, implementing metrics, or just performance measurement in general on your teams, how it changes from startups to growth stage to even like, getting near IPO. So we'd love for you to just, tell some stories and
Yeah.
yeah, tell us your experience about just metrics and performance in general.
Yeah. So I'm just going to think out loud. I don't know what I'm going to say. But what the way that would break this down, right,
Mm-hmm.
is in 2 ways. Number one, I think about tech metrics. So things that you can measure in terms of software delivery, in terms of the code itself. So, for example, commits, pull requests, uptime of a system. So, I think
Mm-hmm.
number one is tech metrics. And then the other part is people metrics, right? How are
Yeah,
people doing? And how do you measure them? So I think it might be good to start on the tech side a
sure.
bit. Feel free to interrupt me because I might go down a couple of rabbit holes. I'd say for a very early stage company, I don't know if this is controversial or not, but let's say you have a few engineers on the team. I'd say metrics are become or are less important early on. You're
Right,
just really trying to go as fast as humanly possible,
right.
get that feature to market without too many bugs in production. I'm afraid to be flamed by at this point by some engineering leaders, but I mean I think that's really the idea, right? I see a lot of early. So I'm a QA guy. I don't know if people know this. I
Hmm,
started my career as a QA engineer,
did
so
not
I'm
know that.
all about testing. I'm all about like quality and all that. I think really early for early stage startups, they try to implement metrics or processes a little bit too early. So if you're a very early company, get the product to market,
Mm-hmm.
right? Hopefully, with not too many bugs in production.
Sure.
I think once the fires stop burning every single day, you have some sort of product market fit. There's consistency in knowing that, hey, the feature that we've delivered is working and users want it and and we're pretty sure this is the feature that's going to stay pretty much the same and we're going to build on top of it. I think
Mm-hmm.
metrics are actually quite useful. at that time, because as an earlier stage startup, you're just pivoting left and right. You might
Right.
be building things and discarding them. But once you found that product market fit and you have a couple of engineers and maybe you're adding a couple more, I think having some type of metrics are very important, right?
Sure.
So I like to look at, okay, if we are now building a foundational system that we want to be stable, I really would like to see unit test coverage, right? To
Okay.
ensure that when we are pushing out new code, we have at least a scaffolding to be able to to be sure that we haven't broken any new code. So, for
Right.
example, when I started at Semaphore, I think we had like five-ish engineers with like, it's probably like three like starting in the following Monday or something like that. And when I said, okay, how am I gonna onboard? They said, hey, you just write tests for 30 days, right? I was
Hmm.
like, oh, that's actually pretty cool. I was like, hey, what's the test coverage? And they're like, I don't know. So I was like, okay, let me take a look. So I hooked up. I'm forgetting the metric tool that we're using at the time, but it hooks into your CI and it tells you what the test metrics are. So essentially we had like 30% test coverage at the time. So
Hmm.
one of the first things I did as a director of engineering was say, hey, we don't have to go back and write tests on top of everything. Like
Right.
that'll slow us down. But hey, how about for every new feature, can we include like a test for every class?
Hmm.
Like, right? Like for all new code that we put in, can we just add some tests?
Right.
So I think like having very lightweight metrics is really, really important early on because what that allows you to do is get feedback from the system and see
Sure.
if the metric that you're using is working or
Hmm.
not.
Do you
And I
have
think,
any recommendations on like some lightweight metrics that early stage companies can think about?
yeah, so I think unit test coverage is a really important one. I think the one, so we've paid for all the tools that you can imagine, and we've paid tens of thousands of tools of dollars for tools that you can imagine that measures everything under the sun,
Right.
as you can
Yeah.
imagine. The tool that I like the most that is now free on GitHub is Panda. I don't know if it's called Panda anymore, but basically what it does is it reminds your team about the pull requests that are open every day.
Oh wow.
And you wouldn't believe it's like, okay, like developers are so concerned about like pushing code, they forget that other developers' code are just ready to get out there. So
Right.
what Panda allowed us to do is to understand how many PRs that we have open and what's the time to close out PRs,
Okay.
which shows me as an engineering leader, are we paying enough attention to closing out other people's PRs? So basically,
Mm.
what we did is we say, hey, every day in the morning, first thing you do, if you're tagged on a PR, go and close it. And that increased our velocity a lot because
Mm.
you weren't sitting and waiting there
Yeah.
on your PR to be closed. So we really liked that metric. And
That's great.
that's why it's key, right? Because unit testing work for us, it might
Hmm.
not work for you
Right.
or it might work great for you. So what you have to do is pick a metric, see if it makes sense for the team, and then implement it.
Sure. And how did those this is when you said I think you guys had 5 engineers.
Yeah.
How did the metrics change over time as a team scaled?
Yeah. I would say that it changed for various reasons.
Sure.
It changed because we went from like 5 to 50. It
Right.
changed because our org got bigger and stakeholders wanted insight. So let's talk about stakeholder insight real quick, right?
Sure.
So as an engineering leader, my butt's on the line if my thing doesn't work, right?
Sure.
And when you go from like 1 or 200 people at the company to like 1,000 people and something is down, you better have a reason to explain why. And
Hmm.
that reason is not because our Kubernetes cluster needed to be like restarted or something like
Right.
that, right? Like, so basically, metrics become really important when you need to communicate cross functionally.
Right.
Marketing is not going to care about Kubernetes.
Right.
The chief marketing officer that needs to sell your product doesn't need. to understand what Kubernetes is, but they need to know like why is our stuff down all the time.
Mm,
So we implemented several monitoring in various ways. And I know when people are thinking about monitoring, they might be thinking monitoring metrics, they might be thinking about Prometheus and Grafana. But hey, listen, one of the most simple thing that we did was use something like Pingdom to
mm.
ping our site every minute or 5 minutes to make sure we're down or not. Right? Like,
Yeah.
when people think about metrics, it's for startups. Obviously, if you're a public company, you might have unlimited resources to get really sophisticated. But when you're a startup going from 2 engineers to 5 engineers or 5 to 10, 10 to 20,
Mm-hmm.
do the lightest weight thing you can to move
Mm.
faster. Once you're swimming in money, you can hire all the engineers you want to do all the metrics you want. But you have
Yeah.
to be able to implement small things that make sense and move fast.
Yeah. So kind of going back to stakeholder,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you're right. The whole point of metrics is to be able to communicate some sort of progress or lack thereof to people that aren't in the code or in the day to day of the technical build out. So, I mean, that being said, like the interesting thing about, I think, performance metrics specifically on tech teams is that you have to communicate up and down, meaning I think you have to get buy in from your team, right? Because I think the biggest pushback from the team is how are these metrics going to be used against me, right? I hear a lot of individual
Yeah.
contributors comment on that, and then on the flip side, non or the business leadership is going to look at the metrics in a very particular way too. It could be for straight up individual performance, or it could just be about general progress. So how do you how did you balance all of those things?
This was the hardest freaking thing I ever did. Right? Like, no one has the answer.
Yeah.
I don't think, right? I think there is some attempt at scientific evidence to prove it. So the book Accelerate.
Yeah. Dr.
Um,
Nicole Forson, for everyone that
yeah.
doesn't know.
Yeah. And I think that book has some really good ideas, and I selectively chose some of them. So, for example, how often you deploy, I think that's a really awesome one. I
Mm-hmm.
think if I had to pick one, that's probably one of the best ones. So, like going back to your question, right? Metrics had a major effect on the team in a lot of ways. So, for example, I I'm the kind of engineering leader that always tries to work within the organization to make sure my engineers are really, really well paid.
Yeah.
Right? Like you gotta give them a great culture and like things of that nature. But I think being able to pay a fair market rate is really important. So I got posed a question by the exec suite one time. It's like, well, how do you prove it? How do you prove that your engineering team is more effective than the market normal, right? So, for
Mm.
example, how do you prove that they're delivering more? How do you prove a certain engineer deserves a bonus?
Why should we pay them more than market rate?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And within Semaphore, there were actually like lots of different teams,
Mm-hmm.
and other engineering teams besides mine by the time it got really big, right?
Right.
And they would say like, well, what makes this engineer better? Or they would pose the question, right?
Sure.
So what makes this engineering better? What makes this engineering team more effective? So we went on this journey of trying to figure it out. So I read all the books, right? I read the Jez Humble stuff, the Nicole
Mm-hmm.
Forsgren book.
Forsgren. Forsgren.
Okay. I apologize, Nicole, if I messed up your name if you're listening to this. And I read everything on the internet. I join RAND leadership Slack and try to like,
Mm-hmm.
see what are other engineering leaders doing. And I think both in theory and in practice, no one has the right answer because we would say, okay, here's a metric that we think is actually useful to judge everyone. And like everyone lost their minds,
Like,
right?
what
Like,
do you have an
oh,
example of that?
so one example is like there's multiple examples. So one is like a team velocity in Jira, right? So it's like, oh shit. Like, so, okay, now we gotta like point the crap out of everything. We either have to like sandbag or be like extremely precise
Mm-hmm.
on everything. Is just an estimation anyways.
Yes.
And how we gotta get judged on this.
Right.
So how that not to actually talk about this because two of my teams, so I had three different verticals. Two of
Mm-hmm.
my verticals, we used points, and one vertical, we didn't use points at all.
Oh wow.
And like we never, that never like went up the chain, if you will. Like, I don't know
Mm-hmm.
if that would have been accepted, but there was a point in time that one of the verticals that were like, okay, like the business is changing its mind all the time. Let's just not do points at all for this. And
Wow.
I think like the point that I'm making there is like metrics sometimes work, metrics sometimes don't. You have
Mm,
to figure out what will work for the team and implement the smallest thing
sure.
and see if that's effective for you. If a metric is really, really important, then it'll be helpful. So I think like there could be some concrete ones like uptime, how often you deploy and things of that nature. And then there's gotta be other ones that are like
Yeah.
not gonna work at all. Like how
Right.
many points did we do this sprint? Like no one's here to do points. We're here to deliver features.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I went down a rabbit hole
No,
there.
that's great. I mean,
Okay.
can you talk a little bit about those? I think three verticals. Like, what
Yeah.
happened with the team that stopped using points? How did they perform differently than the other two teams?
So for those on my team that are listening, I loved you all the same. I love you all the same. Okay, like I didn't love one team more than the other, but it's just like the, so one on the three different verticals, right? Like one was a very stable product,
Mm,
and stability was the most important thing, right?
mm,
And we knew that we for every new feature, it'd be approximately similar. So like points like pretty much worked. Still
got
wasn't
it.
perfect, right? On another one, the stakeholders just changed their minds so often about like what was being done that
Mm,
we just said, okay, it's, and we were delivering projects on a quarterly basis. So we are
mm,
like, okay, just give us the project instead of spending hours per week. So actually, when I got to semaphore, our stand-ups were 1 hour per day. Our pointing was 4 hours per week, twice a week.
oh my gosh. Okay.
So like we got rid of some of that when I got there, but it
Yeah.
took a while to get rid of it. And after a while, we are like, if we spend the 4 hours like actually building features instead, that'll be a lot better. So we're like, okay, this is kind of silly. Let's just get rid of it. And we
Mm,
did, and it worked. I think there was a point by the time I was gone that stakeholders wanted like an appearance of predictability, so it got
mm,
implemented again.
right.
And I'm not there anymore. I haven't been there for a year, so I don't
Yeah.
know. But essentially, yeah, like for that team, it's just like we have the quarterly thing. Let's spend time on something that's more effective because
Sure.
things are changing anyways. And so that's what we did. It actually goes back to an earlier point where if you're an early stage company and stuff's just on fire or you don't have a solidified product roadmap or features yet, figure it out and then put it in the metrics.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think
Yeah.
something you said that was really interesting is like that one team you're talking about, the product, the essentially the product vision or North Star was stability. So kind of backtracking the metrics or how you measure to that actual product or team goal makes total sense, right? That's why the points worked because you could actually effectively measure because it was a more stable product. How can like team leads, engineering managers, whoever think about the metrics in a similar way? Like do you have any advice on questions they can ask themselves to kind of direct, like what is it that we do at a high level that affects those metrics downstream?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. And I guess the way that I would think about it is thinking about just effectiveness, right? And I think that's the big challenge when it becomes a bigger challenge as you become a bigger organization because those that are not in it day to day try to implement things on a team that they have no idea what's going on,
Mm,
right? So a very large organization may ask to implement metrics that have no bearing on reality, right?
Yeah.
I think like where metrics are really effective is when the team says like, hey, I want to know this and we should measure this because
Mm,
we think it'll be better, right?
interesting.
So for example, like with unit test coverage, and I think like all startups like go through this phase, which is like, okay, like I don't know if we need it. Oh, stuff's breaking all the time. I think we need unit testing. Oh, let's start doing it and seeing if
Mhm.
things improve, right? Same way with like UI test coverage, right?
Mhm.
For us, like as I mentioned, the lower hanging fruits is like pinging your website or pinging your APIs to make sure they work, right? Like what's the uptime on your APIs, doing very low hanging fruit ways. So a lot of the best metrics actually came from the team,
Mm.
right? And I would, if there were like one main idea that I have for startups, and I'm speaking much more towards startups than companies that have IPO because
Mhm.
they have the resources and stability to
Sure.
measure what they need. But for the startup teams, like let the engineers get together and share what are the things that they need. And so, for example, when I'm in stand up as an engineering leader, what I'm paying attention to is like status is important, but what I'm listening for are the problems that people
Mm.
are raising. So if someone's coming and say like, "Hey, when someone got look at my PR?" Hey,
Mm.
when someone got look at my PR and you say and someone says it like 5 times, maybe you should measure how fast your PRs are being merged, right?
Mm. Mhm.
Right. So if you hear problems that are being repeated over and over again, you maybe should look into having a metric and having processes that improve that metric,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
So like if someone says, "Oh, our releases are too big," or "Releases are too big," there's too many bugs, then
Right.
maybe a potential solution is to measure how often you release
Right.
and maybe release more. So that's where the point of accelerate and releasing more often
Mhm.
with CI was really helpful.
Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, I feel like we covered a lot in a
Yeah.
little bit of time, but yeah, I think there's a lot of really good tips and tricks here for all engineering managers out there. And I think, you know, the biggest takeaway, at least for me, is it's all contextual. Like, there is no big answer, there's no one solution. And the biggest thing is really understanding the nuances of your team. Because I think what I'm hearing you say is the way you effectively communicate the reasoning, the why behind your metrics is by first understanding how your team works and produces and collaborates so that you can have a good answer to whatever stakeholder you need to speak to, right?
It's well said, man. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Awesome. Well, no, this has been great, Eric. Yeah, I think, for our everyone who's listening out there would love to hear anything you guys want us to cover in the future. And yeah, I think these are really, really rich times. So thank you so much, Eric, for all your insights.
Yeah, and thank you so much for the time, David. And to our listeners, yeah, let us know what you think.
Cool. Thanks so much, y'all.
All right, bye.
Bye.